The game was on. Everyone at the table was watching. Someone was yelling about a play you didn't follow, about a player whose name you'd never learned, about a season you hadn't tracked since it started. The energy in the room had that specific texture, collective, urgent, completely unavailable to you. And you sat there, doing the performance you have done your entire life. The slight lean toward the screen, the appropriately timed reaction, a wince here, a nod there. The careful management of just enough engagement to avoid the question. You know the question. You don't follow sports? Said like not following was the strange position. Like the whole room staking their mood on the outcome of a game played by strangers was the rational default. And you were the one with the software error. You grew up in the 90s. Your generation had Nintendo 64 before it had broadband. You had Tupac, Nirvana, Eminem, the Backstreet Boys. You had Mortal Kombat and Pokemon cards and Final Fantasy VII and 300 channels and the dial-up screech of a world opening up in real time on a desk in your parents' living room. Somewhere inside all of that, in a decade that handed your generation more ways to belong to something than any cohort before had ever been offered, you found your people, your things, the cultural coordinates that told you who you were without requiring you to explain it. Sports wasn't on the map. Not the center of it anyway. Not because something went wrong in your development. Not because you were antisocial or cold or missed the gene that makes a grown adult paint their face for a stranger's career. Because your generation was the first one raised with a wide enough menu that sports was no longer the automatic answer to a question every person has. The question of where to belong. The research on why this happened to 90s kids specifically, and what it says about how you're actually wired, is more interesting than the question you've been asked your whole life. The assumption the room always makes is the same one. If you don't follow sports, you either never had the right person to pass it down, or you're the kind of person who thinks they're above it. Sports gets positioned as the baseline of social participation, the shared language adults are supposed to carry, the easiest entry point into almost any room, the one thing you're expected to have a team for. No team means you owe the room an explanation. What that framing misses entirely is the actual psychological function sports serves, and why the 90s generation specifically built its routes to that function somewhere else. Researchers who study sports fandom have identified something counterintuitive about what watching a game actually does for people. It has almost nothing to do with the sport. At its core, following a team is a delivery system for a set of deeply human psychological needs: group affiliation, the feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself; shared ritual, a recurring event that structures social time and creates collective experience with other people; tribal identity, a visible in-group marker that communicates who you are before you've said a word. Sports delivers all three of those things reliably, which is why it has existed in every known human culture across recorded history. People aren't watching because the ball is fascinating. They're watching because watching together does something for them that most other experiences don't. The generation born in the 1990s was the first cohort handed an entirely new set of delivery systems for every single one of those needs. Gaming communities built tribal identity and shared ritual, tournaments, releases, franchises that structured whole years of social life. Music scenes built fierce in-group belonging with their own visual codes, their own events, their own language. Internet forums and early fandoms built group affiliation at a scale and specificity that traditional sports geography could never match. You didn't have to root for the city you were born in. You could find your exact kind of person across the world at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. For 90s kids, this wasn't a rejection of what sports was offering psychologically. It was a redirection. The needs were the same. The routes were just completely different. And for the first time in human history, there were enough routes that sports was simply one option among many, rather than the default path to belonging. In 2001, psychologist Daniel Wann and colleagues published one of the most cited studies in sports psychology, identifying 8 core motivations behind sports fandom: group affiliation, family bonding, aesthetic appreciation, self-esteem enhancement, escape, entertainment, economic interest, and eustress, the pleasure of controlled tension and uncertainty. The critical finding from Wann's research: every single one of those motivations can be satisfied by something other than sports. None of them are sport-specific. They are human needs that sports happens to meet, and that other cultural experiences can meet equally well, depending on what a person was raised inside. Later, Gallup tracking data confirmed the generational shift in numbers. The percentage of Americans identifying as sports fans declined from 67% in 2000 to 52% by 2017, with the steepest drop concentrated in adults under 35. The generation that came of age with the most diverse entertainment and community ecosystem in human history was, by measurable data, the least likely to route its psychological needs exclusively through the sports channel. You are not a statistical anomaly. You are the documented leading edge of a shift that has been happening across your entire generation for 2 decades. The room that looks at you like you're missing something has the minority position in the data. Here is what the psychology of not following sports actually reveals about the people who don't. You built your tribal identity around something you chose, not something chosen for you by the city you were born in. Most sports allegiances are inherited by geography or family. You root for the team because your father did, because you grew up in that city, because the jersey was hanging in your house before you could read. The people who opt out of that tend to form their belonging around things they actually selected. A music scene, a gaming community, a specific set of ideas. The membership reflects something deliberate about who you are, not just where you happen to land. You also don't outsource your emotional calendar to strangers' performance. A significant psychological function of sports fandom is vicarious investment. The wins and losses of athletes you've never met become the emotional weather of your weekend, your Monday, sometimes your week. Choosing not to run that program is not emotional flatness. It's a decision about where your energy actually goes. And people who make that decision consciously tend to invest more deliberately in the things they do care about. That is not superiority. It is a specific kind of intentionality that the research on alternative community formation consistently finds in people who built their belonging somewhere outside the default system. Every 90s kid who doesn't follow sports has had the same version of the same moment. A room running on a frequency you're not tuned to. A shared language that was never offered to you as a first language. The low-grade social cost of navigating spaces where not having a team feels like showing up without a passport. What you were never told, clearly enough, is that everything that room was getting from the game, the belonging, the ritual, the experience of being part of something with other people, you were getting it somewhere else the whole time. You were getting it from the games you actually stayed up until 2 a.m. to finish, from the albums that meant something beyond background noise, from the online forums where you found 12 people who cared about exactly the same specific thing you cared about, at a level nobody in your physical zip code could match. The question, how do you not care about sports, contains a wrong assumption inside it. It assumes that not caring about sports means not caring about what sports is actually for. You cared about that. You still do. You just found it somewhere the room wasn't looking. And the research says you were never the exception. You were the direction the whole generation was already heading. If that put words to something you've been through for years, subscribe. The next video is something this generation has been carrying just as quietly. You already know whether you want to hear it.